Welcome, everybody. And hopefully you've hit whatever icon you had to hit to say that you're agreeing to be recorded. Welcome, everyone. It's the evening of November 11th in Eastern Time Zone. I'd like to welcome all of you to our conversation with Rachel A. Maizes, author of a collection of short stories, We Love You, Anderson Cooper, which was printed or published in 2019, and a novel, Other People's Pets, which has been published in 2020. I've mentioned first a little bit more about Rachel. She's been born in Queens, New York, specific neighborhood of Bayswater, part of Far Rockaway, we just found out a few minutes ago. Right now she's a resident of Boulder, Colorado. So for her, it's not evening, it's late afternoon. And we will discuss with Rachel which kind of life events have informed her writing process and her books or writing. As usual, our dear President Debbie Goldich and Rabbi Ellen Wollens-Fields send their warm regards. They're unable to be with us today because they both have Women's League for Conservative Judaism business or commitments of their time at this point of the week. And I want to thank Karen Belena for her technical support. As Merle and I tend to organize this, Merle will pose various questions. I'm going to monitor the chat box, and I will be taking notes. And yes, Linda, Loveland is not that far from where I live, and I'm familiar with the location. It's very lovely there on the Little Miami River, is its claim to fame. So Karen's recording, we archive these recordings for future reference on the Women's League for Conservative Judaism website, and Women's League also has a YouTube channel. Thanks to all of you for attending, and I turn the program over to Merle.
Hi, good evening, and thank you, Rachel, for joining us. I would just like to start my first question being, you have your name listed as RL. Are we keeping the Rachel a secret?
No, it's fine to call. It's fine to call me Rachel. I think we've talked about this a little bit. I publish under RL, even though I use the pronoun she, and I have my picture, on the book jacket, so people can tell I'm a woman. It's on my website, so I'm not hiding the fact that I'm a woman. But I don't necessarily want the fact that I'm a woman to be the first thing that people think about when they see my books. And the reason for that is that there are still some men who select books of other men. I think women are better about reading. I know I am. I know most of the women that I know are much better about reading books by both men and women. But unfortunately, we still, I mean, it's crazy, but we still live in an age where some men will veer away from books by women. So I don't want that to be the first thing that they see. I'd rather everybody really just start the book, see if it engages you, and if it engages you, maybe then turn over and see who the author is and be surprised or not surprised that it's a woman and go from there.
All right, so we have discussed already that you grew up in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal background and where you come from and how you ended up in writing?
Sure. I grew up Orthodox, and I was pretty young when I realized that that was going to change for me, that I was always going to identify very strongly as Jewish, but that I wasn't going to necessarily follow all the rules that we have in the Orthodox tradition. For one thing, I found the community to be pretty sexist, to be honest. Especially when I was growing up. I have 3 sisters, so we're 4 girls. None of us had bat mitzvah. So there just starting from that. And then I loved studying Torah, but at my high school, Yeshiva of Flatbush, the boys also studied Talmud, and I didn't really understand why the women should be, it was sort of considered the pinnacle of Jewish study was Talmud in our community. And I didn't really understand why we should be kept out of that. Similarly, I didn't really understand why we should be at the back of the temple where it was harder to hear, why we shouldn't be allowed to lead services. So I knew from pretty early on that I was going to probably leave that community. Having said that, boy, I learned a lot growing up in that community. I learned a lot about the Jewish people. I learned a lot of Torah. I learned a lot of Hebrew, and all that's wonderful. And I'm certainly really happy that that was part of my education. So then I went off to college. I started at Barnard College, and I did think I wanted to be a writer. And I took writing classes, and I won an honorable mention in a writing contest there. And I thought, okay, I guess I don't need any more school. So I dropped out of college, and I started to work in publishing at Scholastic magazines. And I worked at Scholastic for many years. But unfortunately, I kind of stopped doing my own writing at that time. It was a busy profession. I was writing and editing children's educational magazines, which was never anything I had really dreamed of. I really had dreamed of being a fiction writer. So then eventually I went back to school and got my undergraduate degree, and then became a lawyer. And for about 20 years, I practiced law and didn't really write very much. And then I guess I'm going to share kind of a little bit of a sad detail of my life. My mom died suddenly when I was about 40. And it was one of the terrible tragedies of my life. I adored her. She was a really wonderful mother. But I will say that it taught me something, which is because she was 66, but she was at the prime of her life. She was volunteering. She was a therapist and having clients. She was traveling with her sisters. She was learning new languages. So she was so vibrant, and then was in an accident, unfortunately, and passed away. But what it taught me was you can't necessarily say tomorrow. If there's something you really want to do, you really have to do it. None of us know how long we have. And so really from that day forward, I started writing every day and taking writing classes and going to writing conferences. And very slowly, I developed a new skill, which was to be a fiction writer, and started having my stories published first, then the collection of stories, and then the novel.
You have such a unbelievable, to me, creative imagination in all of these stories. Were you that way when you were a child? Did you come up with these wild fantasies?
So thank you so much. I did. When I was young, so I really loved telling stories, and I grew up with a lot of cousins. And on Shabbat, of course, we didn't turn on the TV. We didn't get in our cars to go anywhere. And I would get together with these cousins, and I would make up stories for them. And they would be about, sometimes I had this green, I never played with dolls, but I had this green squishy alien that I played with. And I would make up, his name was Unga, and I would make up stories for all of my cousins about Unga. And so I guess I would have to say yes, that my imagination tended toward the weird, even when I was very young.
I mean, I think the stories are fabulous, but they are just some of the things that you came up with, I think just are so really outside the box and on the edge. So it's fascinating to wonder how your mind works.
I will also say that I love magical realism. I mean, I read magical realism. I love it as a literary tradition. So it wasn't just that I had a bent toward that, but I actually really admire writers who write in that way. Whether it's Kevin Wilson, who came out with a book, I guess about a year or two ago, called Nothing to See Here, about children who self-combust. And it's not a sad story. They don't get burned up. They just burn things around them. But it's a really terrific story. And all the other wonderful magical realist writers. So
how do you think your Jewish background and your legal background, how have they influenced your writing?
Well, obviously from the Jewish background, if you look at the stories, there's the bar mitzvah story, there's the story Yiddish lessons, which is probably the most autobiographical story. Not that I ever pushed a baby out a window, I want to assure everyone, but that feeling of that girl of being outside certainly was, comes from my feeling when I was young, of being excluded from the action, so to speak, because I was a girl. So there's that story. I think there's the Hanukkah Christmas story. So I think you'll see a lot of Jewish themes in my writing. The novel too has main characters who are Jewish. It's not quite as Jewish as some of the stories, but still the main characters are Jewish, and that informs some of the book, the novel. And then some of what I read certainly influenced me. I mean, I loved Isaac Bashevis Singer growing up. I loved Chaim Potok growing up. I loved Philip Roth when I was a little older, and still love Philip Roth, even though obviously a lot of people have a lot of issues with him. Not to get into it, I don't want to get into a debate. I just think as a writer, his writing is quite amazing. So that was a big part of what I read. Now, I certainly read other writers that were not Jewish especially when I got older, but especially as a child, I really love, the Chaim Potok books, especially The Chosen, The Promise, My Name is Asher Lev, especially because all of them really have main characters who are also wrestling with their Judaism. And I was wrestling with my Judaism when I was a child, and it was so wonderful to have books that reflected that. So that's from that point of view. The legal education that I had, so I'm trying to think if any of the stories deal with legal issues. Maybe the one, they don't really too much. I was going to say, maybe the woman who's cut out of the will, but that's just kind of the background for the story. It's not, so I don't think it does. In the novel, there's crimes and criminal law. So that definitely, having had a legal education and studied criminal law, it made it easier to write that novel, because the main characters are burglars in the novel.
Right.
Right. So there I had some background that was really helpful in terms of that. But I actually purposely don't write about some of the more interesting things I might have been privy to when I was a lawyer. And the reason for that is because as a lawyer, you owe a duty of confidentiality to your clients. And so I think it's a really tricky line to write about things, even if you think you're changing them enough. You might think you change the name, you change the gender, you change the city. There's still something that could seep through that maybe even if it's only the client, him or herself, who reads it, who recognizes themselves, that's too much, in my opinion. And there's plenty of good material that doesn't come from that aspect of my life. So, I think I actually almost purposely stay away from that material.
So, all right. So looking at the two books, first, we'll focus on the short stories and We Love Anderson Cooper. And then let's discuss other people's pets to follow that up. Why did you pick the Anderson Cooper, the bar mitzvah story, as your title story and your lead story? How did you decide?
So I didn't. I didn't. My title story was Collections, which is the second story. And I don't know why I chose Collections, except it's one of my favorite stories in the book, although it's a quieter, it's not I have a few favorites, but it's a bit of a quieter story, but I just love those characters, and I thought it'd be a nice entree into the book. My editor very much disagreed. She thought it was, I think, too quiet a story, and that the bar mitzvah story was more relatable, more culturally interesting and relevant. And she asked me if I minded. She didn't impose it on me, but she asked me if I minded. I obviously like that story a lot too. It was the second story in the book. So I hadn't buried it. It was just the second one. So I trust her judgment, and I was perfectly happy to swap those. And I actually agreed with her points of view, that it is a very relatable story. And if you think about it, when people go into the bookstore, if they're on Amazon and they download a sample on their Kindle, that's what they're going to get. So it's a pretty important story. It's pretty important, I think, to start with a story that will really hook people. And I think in the end, she was right. That was a better story to use as a hook.
Right. Well, and the title, as the title of the book, it's definitely very catchy.
Right. Well, so yeah. Thank you.
So why did you pick Anderson Cooper though as the representative of
I thought using him in that story in the way that he's used when the mom says, why couldn't you tell us? We love Anderson Cooper. I thought that I hoped that it was a funny line. I intended it to be a funny line. And then it showed a little bit kind of her blind spot. She had a bit of a blind spot. And then again, I agree with you. I hoped for it to be the title of the book, that it was both quirky enough and intriguing enough that people would read that title and go, we love Anderson Cooper. And then there's a bird on the title, on the cover. And people might go, what the heck? What is this? And they might be moved to open it up and start reading.
So there are a lot of different themes that you use throughout but there is something kind of similar, I think, throughout all the stories. Like, I guess either you said or I read somewhere that the plots are like an exaggeration of human behavior, dealing with like jealousy and rejection and as you said, magical realism. Which ones were your favorites? Maybe I'll start there instead.
Well, so I think that what's the title is oh gosh, I'm blocking it. I'm gonna peek.
Yes.
Tattoo. Tattoo is one of my favorites. For one, it's magical realism. So again, that's one of the genres that I like. And second of all, I think it's one of my favorites because it was so hard to write. I struggled with that story for years to get the magical realism to where I wanted it, where I thought I could bring the reader along and I wouldn't lose if they could believe in it a little bit, suspend disbelief really while they were reading it. I also liked the point the story was making, which was to some degree about appearances and about how we change our appearances and what we hope for when we change our appearances and what we may get or not get when we change our appearances. So it was a little bit of social commentary. Hopefully, I hope to have somewhat of a light touch. Obviously, I didn't want to bang people over the head with it. But so I thought the story came together in a very satisfying way. I love the Judah Maccabee story too. That story was on Hanukkah Lights on NPR. And I thought that I succeeded with some of the humor in that story. So I enjoyed, both writing it, and I hope people enjoy reading it because I like when I can write funny. And then what was one of the other, and then people will think this is strange, but I like a cat called Grievous, which is certainly one of the stranger, I'm aware that it's one of the stranger stories in the book. It's another jealousy story, that's for sure. It's almost a surrealist story, not so much magical realism. It's almost surreal. I certainly don't expect people to think that there's a cat out there like Grievous, or that there's a woman and a man and a woman who does the things that Eugenia does in that story. But again, I thought it was a fun story and a little bit again of a social commentary about motherhood and what do we expect of mothers? Is it okay not to have a mothering instinct? So it was a story I had fun with.
So we'll start with the tattoo artist he gets a job. He actually is a real painter, and then he, I don't know, has a mental block or can't paint, and then goes to decide to be a tattoo artist, and he's painting these very realistic nipples on cancer survivors, and he actually goes and alters himself also. So the women feel so good about themselves because he's changed their bodies, and then he changes his body, and at first he sort of likes it, and his wife even sort of seems to like it, but then in the end, right, he realizes that I guess sort of that idea that you can't change the outside because you still are who you are on the inside, or that maybe the outside shouldn't matter so much, I guess was the
Yes.
message that I sort of felt
Yeah.
from that. And then the story about the other one that you mentioned before was the one, actually the Yiddish lesson is the one I had the hardest time with. I thought that was, the other ones all were sort of, there was some tongue in cheek, there was some humor to them. But that one really hit me hard. I went back and like read the beginning again to think, did I really think that that's what you're suggesting, is that the child is pushed by the other child out the window?
Well, she allows her to fall. Let's put it there. I don't think she pushes her the way the story is written. I think she very much allows.
Right, not pushes. She sort of
fall out the window.
Makes it very right.
Yeah, she suggests, or maybe the child says up, and she says yes, and the window's open, and yeah.
That was a hard one to read.
I let my sister. I have 3 sisters. I'm close to all of them, and one especially. And I let her read most of my stories. But I don't think I ever let her read that before it was published, because she never wants to. She has 3 children, and she never wants to read anything bad happening to a child. I was like, you're not going to like this one. Just don't, maybe skip over it.
Because if she thought you would have done that to her, you would have to go to a lot of therapy for that.
Right.
How about the story of the couch, the therapist that finds this magical couch?
Yes, that's one of the oldest stories in the book. And again, it's a magical realist story. So, it has that magic couch. And I think what I like about that story is that it shows that people can change. And I will say that I have been to many therapists in my life. Many of them have helped me, and some of them provide good material. So, it was fun to explore. It was fun to explore a therapist as a main character.
So talking about the opening story, we love Anderson Cooper. I guess something that reminded me of, as he's standing on the bima and proclaiming his sexual preference from the bima at his bar mitzvah. It reminded me of the old rabbi's story, or the old Jewish tale of a woman who is gossiping in town, and the rabbi comes to her and gives her a feather pillow, and he says, throw the feathers out. And then he says, now you have to gather them all back in. And she says, well, I can't get them all back. And it's like this, Lashon Hara is like this.
Right.
Was that something that you were trying to write about, or was it just more about this young boy and his feelings?
I think it was more about the young boy. The story was inspired by a couple of things that happened over the years that I was aware of. So I was in Boulder, Colorado, and this is many years ago. Young man was the valedictorian at his Christian academy here in Boulder, and he wanted to come out as gay in his valedictory speech, and the school would not allow that. They censored his speech. So instead, there's an organization in Boulder called Out Boulder, which is an organization that supports gay rights, and they allowed him to come give what he wanted to give, the valedictory speech, to them. And they invited the media. And so the media came, and his speech went viral. Very beautiful speech. And he was able to give it to the whole world, really, which was very cool. So that happened. So that was one thing that probably was a little seed in the back of my mind. Another thing that happened was that there was a young man who did a dance routine at his bar mitzvah. It was videotaped, and it went viral. And I don't know if you remember that. And he ended up on Ellen. So there's a Ellen thread in the story. And so that probably planted a little seed. And then I was at a writing conference, and I was in a class, and I just got this idea that I wrote in the margins of my page. I was taking notes on the class, but I wrote in the margins, have a boy come out at his bar mitzvah, like write a story about that and what that would look like. So that was one of those were some of the influences. There's another important influence. Philip Roth has a short story. He has a collection called the conversion of the Jews. He has a collection called The Conversion of the Jews, and he has a story called The Conversion of the Jews. That's the title story. And it's a magnificent story about a young boy in Hebrew school who says to the teacher, if God can do anything, why can't he create a virgin birth?
Oh, I remember that story.
It's right. It's an amazing story, and he gets into all kinds of trouble. And I always really admired that story. So obviously the facts of my story are very different, but this young boy who comes face to face with authority and has trouble with, the authority, whether it's the authority being the Torah itself and the Parsha that he's supposed to read that says that he's not allowed to live the kind of life he wants to live, or whether it's the rabbi who doesn't want him to come out from the bima. In that sense, it was inspired by this other young man in the Philip Roth story who also is having trouble with authority in his Hebrew school. So those were some of the things that I think inspired me to write that story.
So you say some of the stories are new and some are older. How were you writing the book, like continuously, or you just wrote stories and then compiled it later?
So I was writing the stories over about 10 years, but I wrote many other stories that were not included in the book. When the story was on NPR, I thought to myself, okay, at this point, and that was the Judah Maccabee story. At this point, I think I probably could get a publisher interested. So I looked back at the body of work I had created over the 10 years, and I tried to select stories that I thought went together. I also tried to select the strongest stories, because obviously some of the stories from earlier in my career, I wouldn't feel were strong enough to include in a collection, because I was able to develop as a writer over that time. And then I started sending it to agents to try to find an agent. And some of them felt that some of the stories were stronger than others. And I actually took their advice and I swapped out some stories from the original manuscript that I was sending around, and ended up, I hope, with the strongest possible manuscript.
Yes, I think very good. So also in a lot of these stories, we have a lot of animals that play some of them almost human roles.
Yes.
So in the Judah Maccabee story, we're told about Barry Waxman, who it says his life is full and he lives with Annette, who has bettered his life, which I thought was very cute, also very funny, filleting fish, unclogging drains, and debugging his computer. Important things that every man wants his woman to be able to do. And he has a cat that he's very close to. And then the cat starts to pay a little bit too much attention to Annette, and he becomes jealous of the relationship of Annette and his cat, which also coincides with a tug of war between Hanukkah and Christmas, because she celebrates Christmas and he celebrates Hanukkah. So those two things, the cat and the holiday, are sort of intertwined.
Right.
And he's having trouble with both of those. But it's funny that you use an animal as instead of like another woman or somebody else. So why animals playing such a large part in these?
So in that particular story, and in some of the other stories, I like using animals because jealousy is not an uncommon theme in literature, right? Because it's not an uncommon universal theme. I mean, we all feel it sometime or another. But I like using animals to get at jealousy because it helps me differentiate the story from some of the stories that have gone before. It gives me a slightly different angle on it. And I enjoy that. I also think it helps me bring out some humor in the situation. So while obviously we feel for Barry, but we're also chuckling a little bit because we know he's a little bit absurd sometimes with his jealousy over this cat. Another reason that I write about animals is that, I mean, I love animals. I really am, close to animals. I have animals. My animals are my children. I'm vegan, so I don't eat animals. I have volunteered at shelters. My novel is all about animals. It's about an animal empath who can feel, and she's a veterinary student. She can feel in her body what the animals are feeling, which makes her a really good veterinary student, a good person to heal animals. So I'm always very interested in animals. And I also think we live in an age where more and more people relate very closely to their animals, and that animals can help people who might live alone from being lonely, can help people who might, for whatever reason, not be able to relate so well to other people, can still give them relationships in their life. So for all of those reasons, I really enjoy writing about animals. Though I will say I'm working on a new novel, and I'm trying very hard not to have it, to keep animals out of it.
No animals?
Well, so there is one, I have to say there is one animal, but for the most part, the book does not, it certainly doesn't revolve around animals in any way. So I'm trying to broaden myself.
So, so another one that I thought was really interesting was Ghost Dogs, which was also a little sad, about a relationship falling apart, it seemed, after the death of the dogs. That the wife, but then the theme really, I guess, would be that the wife felt better when her husband was sick and she had to take care of him, and he was more dependent on her. And then as he gets better, she feels less needed and also guilty for the death of the two dogs.
Right.
Is there a special message that you were sending
No,
us?
I think that's it. I mean, I really did want to explore animals dying, because again, I think sometimes we lose animals, and we're not really allowed to grieve in the same way that we're allowed to grieve for people. And for many of us, for many people, the animals might be the connection they had on a very, on everyday basis, which they might not have with another person, right? I mean, the animal might, the cat or the dog that the person lost might have been the creature that they actually said good morning to, right? Might have been the creature they took care of. It might have been the only other living thing that they had a relationship with. And so, and then the loss is very hard. The loss can be very hard, even if you have a partner, and society doesn't always recognize it, right? Like, we don't have funerals, really. Most people don't have funerals for animals. We, we don't take time off necessarily to grieve our animals. So I did want to explore that deep grief that people can feel for their animals in that story. And also, as you said, that secondary theme too of sometimes when you're a caretaker, whether it's of an animal or of a person, there's a loss when you're no longer the caretaker. There's a void, and just explore that a little bit too in that story.
Yeah. So speaking of loss, one other story was the No Shortage of Birds.
Yes.
About the mother giving her daughter a bird sort of as a gift after her father dies. But I guess sort of, right, maybe not as a replacement really, but that's how the daughter takes it. So it's also that same kind of feeling, I guess, maybe in reverse.
Yes. Yes. Again, trying to maybe in that case, the daughter felt a double loss, right? But of the people, not of the animal, right? Because it was the mother who maybe was looking to the animal to fill a void, right, and the daughter who, as a result, felt she had lost both of her parents. Which, again, those are both two very legitimate reactions to animals, right? For some people to feel very close and to feel that they help them. And for other people, I do think that I don't think it's unusual for people to feel jealous of animals, by the way. And I actually had the experience myself. So I'll share a little bit. I mean, I had two wonderful dogs, and then I met my wonderful second husband, and he had a dog, and he had a cat. So we moved in together. We had 3 dogs and a cat. But I was going out to work as a lawyer, and he worked from home. And because he worked from home, one of my dogs, who I was so bonded with, started to pay more attention to him. And I remember telling my sister, same sister, I remember telling her, I don't know what to do. I can't. And she was so wonderful. My sister said, she said, children go through periods. Sometimes the mother's the favorite, sometimes the father's the favorite. And what was so meaningful to me about her saying that was that she realized how important the dog was to me.
Right.
It was an acknowledgement on her part. She didn't say, "Oh, it's just a dog, don't worry about it." It's, no, she knew, she understood how important that relationship was to me. And of course, that made me feel a lot better.
Yeah.
So I do, having experienced it myself, and I've heard other people talk about this phenomenon too, where they felt jealous of an animal. So that's, again, probably why it came up in the story.
So as we're talking about animals, and you mentioned your other book, so your novel is called Other People's Pets, and it was fabulous. It's short and sweet, but it really is excellent, about a young woman who wants to help raise money to help her father cover his legal fees, because he's been arrested for home robberies. And of course, his daughter has learned how to rob houses also from her father. So how else would she find a way to raise some quick cash to help him out? But she's going to try and rob a few houses herself. But she's an animal empath. I don't know, is that something that people are? That you use that
as far as I
terminology.
know, right. I mean, I think there are people who consider themselves animal empaths in the sense that they think they can read animals' minds, communicate, they're animal communicators, but I don't think there's anybody who is an animal empath in the way that the main character Lala is. I mean, she's an animal empath in that she can feel animals' pain in her body. And that's not something I've ever heard of. That's something that, as far as I know,
You just made up.
I made up. Yeah.
All right. So, when she goes into some of these houses and there happens to be a pet home, and they're in pain, she feels their pain and she can't leave without helping the animal. What was the impetus for this book? Why have a home burglar as your secondary character, I guess, and his daughter as the main character?
Right. So I'm not quite sure I know the answer to that. I sometimes when we write things as writers, I'm not sure we always know where they come from. I will say that my house was burgled a bunch of times when I was growing up.
Oh.
And one time when I was in it, and I was home with a friend, it was after Shabbat and nobody else was home. And I think I was about 12. And I heard someone come in the house. I was upstairs and I heard someone come in the house downstairs. And I thought it must be my dad, because my dad wasn't the kind of person to shout, "Honey, I'm home." He would just come in quietly. So I shouted out. I heard someone coming up the stairs and I said, "Oh, hi, Dad." And I heard, "Oh shit, there's somebody here." And then footsteps going down the stairs. So my friend and I ran into my parents' room. That was the only room that had a lock. And we locked the door. And I called 911. And until the police came, which was probably maybe 5-10 minutes, I was screaming, "The police are coming, the police are coming." The police came, the burglars had left, which was good. But there was probably some element of trauma in that experience that I might have decided, I'm going to actually write about burglars as a way to take control of a situation. Because obviously, I could have written a book about victims too, right? But I thought I'd write about the burglars. I thought I'd research burglars and how their minds work, which I did. I read all these interviews with burglars that sociologists have done and that police officers have done. And I interviewed sheriffs and I interviewed district attorneys and criminal lawyers to just get into the minds of these burglars and to understand their MO, how they work, so I could describe it accurately in the book. And there was probably something about that experience. I mean, first of all, it was fascinating, but in addition to that, it probably helped me feel a little more in control around that issue.
That's interesting that you write to take control of your own feelings, of your own fears or different issues. That's interesting. And there's a few ethical dilemmas in this book this girl, is doing something illegal to help her father. She knows it's going to affect her life, which I was worried about her the whole time. So how did you deal with the, the idea of this ethical dilemma of, do you help your parent, or, should you just push him aside? He's done horrible things in his life, like just let him go to jail. Or should I do something like waitress to get money, or rob some houses? This is going to ruin my personal relationships. I could get myself end up in jail.
Right. So, I mean, I think books are interesting when the characters are complex. And so I think we see a lot of good in Lala, right? I mean, she's helping animals. She wants to help her father. And I think we see her making some maybe questionable decisions in the book. And to me, those are the most interesting books when I read them. I don't necessarily want a character who's all good or all bad. I want a character who has a mix of characteristics. And then, one of the ways to deal with the moral dilemmas is to actually watch her wrestle with them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so much. Maybe to see, can she grow in the book? What does that look like? The story actually has two main characters, right? She's a main character, but her father Zev is also a main character. And to see his journey, and to see their two different journeys, and to see how they maybe deal with this issue of burglary somewhat differently, and have different outcomes as a result, perhaps. So, I think it was it was fun to follow their trajectories, and to just see, where could I take them? What could each of them learn? In what ways could they grow? In what ways would they fail to grow?
So having written short stories and a novel, which do you prefer one to the other now, or do you find one easier than the other?
So, I wrote the stories for many years, and then I wrote a novel, and now I'm writing a second novel. And I'm going to be, well, to be honest, there's something nice about the novel format, in the sense that you get a lot more room to explore things. And you get, so in that sense, it allows you to explore things even more deeply sometimes. And I like that. So I think that's why I'm drawn at this point in my career to the novel format. To be completely honest, it's a little easier to sell a novel to a publisher, because more people are interested in reading novels. And I read collections all the time, but I do read more novels than collections. There's something a little challenging about reading a collection of short stories, and that's that if you have 11 stories in the book, you have 11 beginnings. And the beginning is always a little challenging, right? You're trying to figure out the universe. You have to put a little more work into that beginning to get your bearings in the story. Whereas for the novel, you have one beginning to get the landscape, and then you can read it for a week, maybe, or depending on how fast a reader you are. And in fact, when I write stories, I try to introduce the reader to them as quickly as possible, to get the lay of the land, as quickly as possible, to know what's the issue here and who is this main character, so that there isn't that much work for them. But I think, at least for this point in my career, I'm a little more interested in writing a couple of novels and see where I can take them.
I think for me, the difference between short stories and novels, I guess I've always felt, was that a novel, you have more time to really get attached to the characters. In short stories, you don't. But I have to say that in your short stories, there were a number of them where I did feel for the character very quickly, and was concerned, like emotionally attached to their trajectory of the story. So I thought that was interesting, that I really did connect with each of the characters in each of the stories.
I'm thrilled to hear that. I'm so happy to hear that, really.
So that was,
Thank you.
So I think you did a great job doing this. So I tell everybody, if you haven't read the books, read both of them. They're both excellent. We love Anderson Cooper and Other People's Pets. And I look forward to the next one. I'm very excited. So Susan, do we have some questions from?
As of right now, no one has added anything yet to the chat. So we open it up to the floor. If you want to use, let me see, I got to figure out, we have 44 participants. So does
Well, if you
everybody
raise a hand
know?
or use the chat, yeah.
You could, yeah, so either you could use the chat box or you could use these tools at the reaction tools, which allow you to raise your hand and so forth. So that's all the way on the right. Well, I'm using a laptop. For those of you using a tablet, it comes out a little differently. But I see some familiar faces from people who've participated before. So anybody have?
Some questions to add, otherwise we'll keep talking.
Well, and I'll say, I'm happy to answer questions both about the book and about my writing process and about the publishing industry. So if anyone is interested, has questions about any of those areas, feel free.
And I just want to mention that there was a message here. Wendy Honigman revealed that they had a dog who had a bat mitzvah, and when the dog passed away, they sat shiva for the dog.
Right.
So just an example of the connectivity people have with their pets.
Yeah, and
I'm
so
not a good
many.
example.
Well,
'cause I've
we
never
didn't.
owned a pet.
It was
So-
our friends who came to visit. It was like sitting Shiva. It
Yeah.
wasn't. I don't want anybody to think that we were belittling Judaism in our
Yeah.
traditions.
Well,
We
just
were not.
and to say, Wendy, so many shuls now have blessings of the animals. So it's not, I don't think it belittles it at all. I think it's the shuls are realizing that these are important relationships in people's lives and that animals can be real blessings for us. And they want to help us celebrate that. And I think it's wonderful.
Well, this was in 1985,
Wow.
I guess, and it wound up being in the newspaper. And a reporter had come out and took a picture of the Cocker Spaniel. So we put a keepot on her. I mean, we didn't know what to do. So we put a keepot on her and they took a picture of her. And there was this whole article. And some people were very upset because they felt that it was setting Jewish-Christian relations in Jacksonville back many years. I mean, and the whole thing started because the dog and our daughter had the same birthday and she turned 21. So she was 7 years older than the dog. So we said, oh, well, we'll just have this big thing. And we invited most of our congregation to come. And it was just like a fun way to celebrate New Year's Day. It wasn't, it turned out that a lot of people put meaning into it that we didn't start with. But anyway.
Since I don't see anybody raising their hand visually or using the digital platform to do that, the other week, Merle, Rachel, and I had a mini Zoom conversation. And one of the things that I mentioned about the stories is that some of them have some rather precipitous or rapid ending. And you end and you say, wait, there has to be more to the story. I don't know how many of you felt that way. You want to motion to me if you've read this,
You agree?
these stories, did you feel that some of the stories it's like, wait a minute, there's how did it end like that? So I'm curious, I see that Nancy in Ithaca felt that way. I think you mentioned that. Did anybody else feel that way who's read the stories? All right.
So one of the things we talked about, Susan, was that, and I think you suggested this, and I agreed, that was, perhaps you asked me if I wanted people to kind of imagine what came next, and I agreed that I do like opening, the ends to be a little open-ended for a few reasons. One of which is absolutely, I like people to imagine what comes next in their own minds and to create kind of a secondary end in their own minds. But also, partly, I feel like life doesn't tie up neatly in a bow. And nothing in life does. So I want the endings to have enough resolution to feel like they're satisfying stories, but not be so neatly tied up that it wouldn't be reflective of reality or realistic or satisfying to me as a reader. So that's kind of what I'm thinking when I create an ending like that.
So tell
Thank
us a
you,
little bit
Rachel.
about your writing. Do you go to Starbucks and get a coffee and sit and write, or do you write in a very quiet?
Yes. So I really treat writing as a job I love and adore and look forward to every day, and feel so blessed to be able to do it, especially since I didn't spend a good part of my life doing it. So I look forward every day to doing it. I have a home office. I'm in it right now. And I write from about 8 to 12 because I'm very fresh in the morning. So I really enjoy that. I usually get up, take the dog out for a nice walk, have a little breakfast, talk to my husband a little bit, have some coffee, and then I really go to work. And I will work from 8 to 12, and then I'll take a break and for a little while, and then maybe I'll do an hour or two in the afternoon. But the morning is really when I work. I shouldn't say never, but I almost never go to coffee shops. I would only go to a coffee shop if there was some construction nearby, or somebody making really a big racket. And because I really do like the quiet, I really enjoy. I don't listen to music. I live in a very quiet neighborhood in Colorado. It's actually Boulder County. It's called Niwot. If any of you are familiar with it, it's just a very, very quiet neighborhood. There are some ranches and farms nearby, and not a lot of cars, and so it's really delightful to have the quiet, and that's how I like to write. And I see.
Okay, so someone's asking if you outline your stories and your plot lines in advance.
Right. So, we in writing, we have two names for different kinds of writers: plotters and pantsers. And the plotters are people who plot things out ahead of time, certainly novels and also stories. And the pantsers are the ones who fly by the seat of their pants, especially in the first draft. I swear by being a pantser. It's the only way I know how to work. So the first draft of anything I write is me telling myself the story as if I were someone else. I never know how it's going to end. I don't know what the middle looks like. I'm just creating a character and following along to see what they do. That means I have to do a lot of revision because it's not going to come out right the first time. And once I realize where it's going at the end, I have to go back to the beginning and make sure I plant all the seeds so it makes sense that it ends up where it does. With my novels, same thing. The first draft is just me telling myself the story, and I don't outline. But then quite often I'll create an outline from that first draft, and I'll see there's a lot of problems. There might be plot holes. There might be characters who disappear, walk off the stage and never come back, issues I've raised and not resolved. And then I will go back into the book and start solving some of those problems using that outline.
So some authors say that they actually, not that the character, that the character sort of speaks for itself. Like they start, but then the character really takes the story along. Do you feel that way?
Absolutely. I'm often looking at a scene and saying, no, especially when I'm revising, the character wouldn't do that. Or of course, the character has to do this before they do that. So I'm absolutely, and then of course, everything that happens, I have to think, would this character really do that? Especially once I've started creating them, they definitely take on a life of their own. Yeah. In fact, as I mentioned, I'm vegan. And in my new novel, which I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I will say that the character, I didn't think the character was going to be vegan because there was no reason. Like the character in Other People's Pets is vegan because she loves animals. She's an animal empath. It makes sense that she's vegan and wouldn't eat meat. But I have this new novel, and the character, the main character has very little to do with animals. So she wasn't going to be a vegan. Why would she be? But then I realized, oh my goodness, she's an environmentalist. I was about halfway through the book, or 2/3 of the way through, and I thought, oh my goodness, she's an environmentalist. Of course she's a vegan, because meat production, cows and cattle, create a lot of pollution. She would absolutely not eat meat. And I was so happy I got to make this character in my new novel a vegan, but for a completely different reason. Not because she loves animals, but because she has an environmental view of the world that's going to naturally lead her to be vegan.
Interesting. All right. So now I have a question. Are there ways that being a Jewish woman in 2021 informs the writing?
Very interesting. I mean, obviously, you saw in the stories, right, that whether it was a Jewish character coming out, right, or whether it was a Jewish character wrestling with all the Christmas that was being celebrated around him, and what did he do with that? So I absolutely think that it did inform those stories. I will tell you that even though in other people's pets the characters are Jewish, and being Jewish informs some of the ways they think about the world, the new book, the characters are not Jewish, and they may become Jewish later, but right now they're not Jewish. And like not writing, I'm actually trying to do that too. I'm trying to stretch myself a little and move a little bit further away from maybe the communities that I grew up with, to seeing the communities where I am now in Colorado that are much less Jewish than the Queens, New York community I grew up in, and reflecting some of that in the book.
And someone is asking if your sisters stayed religious or
not one, but one is very traditional. She's conservative, very traditional. And then I would consider myself pretty traditional in the sense that I identify as Jewish. I celebrate Jewish holidays, not in an Orthodox way, but trying to make a nice meal, trying to bring family around. And then the other two, I think, are less so. This was a funny year, right? Because it was the high holy days, and it was hard to go to shul because of COVID. And here in Colorado, we're having a terrible surge. And I saw that the 92nd Street Y was doing online services. And so I immediately logged on, and they were so beautiful. And I immediately texted my sisters to say, hey, I don't know what you're doing today, but there's these amazing services at 92nd Street Y, and all of them logged on, and we were all basically at shul together on our computers, and they just loved it. So no, nobody's Orthodox anymore, but all of us certainly feel very Jewish and very connected.
Right. Yes, I think over Zoom now, you can go to services anywhere. You can pick your show. You don't have to go to the one that's down the street. And right. I've had a great time doing that. I think that's been one of the highlights. So yes. So if there are any other questions, or I'm just going to repeat that everybody should be reading both these books. We love Anderson Cooper and Other People's Pets. And thank you so much for coming and joining us tonight. And this was terrific conversation.
So I want to thank you so much, Merle and Susan, for organizing this and your hard work. I know you're volunteers, and so I just can't tell you how much I appreciate getting to talk to the audience, and for everyone who's read it, I so appreciate you reading it. And everyone should just be well, and we should all get through this together.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel and Merle, for moderating or posing a lot of questions. I want to thank everyone for attending. We hope you enjoyed this virtual conversation and gained insights to the power of literature for the reader and the author. I think Rachel shows how empowering her writing is for herself in her life.
Yep.
So our next Women's League Reads event, if you want to write this down, it will be Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time Zone on January 27th in 2022. So it's going to be a while since we meet again virtually. We're going to be interviewing a young author. Her name is Alyssa Friedland. Her last name is spelled Friedland. She's written a novel that was published in 2021. It's a humorous novel about the Catskill vacation scene called Last Summer at the Golden Hotel. So if you have any additional questions, you're welcome to email Merle or me. And because we're arriving before Thanksgiving and Hanukkah, best wishes for all of you to have a meaningful and pleasant Thanksgiving holiday and celebration of Hanukkah. Or Sameach, may we all be blessed with light and goodness. Thank you so much.